Xavier Poulsen's hands were rust-colored, permanently stained by 36 years at the BorgWarner plant in Muncie, Indiana. No amount of lava soap could scrub away that particular badge of honor, not that he'd want it gone. The rust had seeped into the cracks of his palms, the whorls of his fingerprints, the half-moon cuticles framing nails perpetually trimmed short for safety around the machines. Even on his days off, when he'd run his fingers through his thinning hair, he'd sometimes catch his reflection and notice the rusty smudges he'd left on his temples. His wife Judith had long stopped complaining about the stains on the bathroom towels. On a cold February morning in 2009, Xavier stood at his bathroom sink, scrutinizing those hands. They were different now at 54 than they had been at 18 when he'd first walked through the factory gates. The fingers had thickened, joints swollen from repetitive work, a scar running along his right index finger where he'd caught it in a transfer case assembly in '93, 12 stitches and back to work the next day. The company doctor had been impressed. "You going to be in there all morning?" Judith called through the door. "Coffee's getting cold." "Coming," Xavier replied, drying his hands on the towel, adding another rust-colored streak to the fabric. In the kitchen, Judith stood at the stove, her bathrobe cinched tight against the chill. The furnace was acting up again, and Xavier had added it to his mental list of weekend projects. The kitchen, like most of their modest three-bedroom ranch home on the south side of Muncie, remained largely unchanged since they'd bought it in 1981. The wallpaper, yellow with small blue flowers, had faded around the windows. The linoleum floor, once bright white with blue speckles, had worn to a dull gray in the high-traffic areas. Xavier had always planned to renovate it all someday, but someday never seemed to arrive. "You're going to be late," Judith said, sliding eggs onto his plate. At 52, her dark hair was threaded with silver, pulled back in a practical ponytail for her shift at Ball Memorial Hospital, where she worked in billing. "That's the third time this week." "Mark won't care," Xavier said, though they both knew it wasn't true. Mark Donovan, shift supervisor, cared about everything, especially punctuality. But lately, Xavier had found himself moving slower in the mornings, as if his body was resisting the day ahead. "Heard anything more about those rumors?" Judith asked, sitting across from him with her own plate. Xavier shook his head, focused on cutting his eggs into perfect squares. "Just talk, always talk." But it wasn't just talk, and they both knew it. The rumors had started last summer, whispers about BorgWarner's Muncie transmission plant closing, moving operations to Mexico. For months, management had denied it, then equivocated, then finally admitted they were exploring options. After the September financial collapse, the whispers had grown louder, more insistent, until they became the only thing anyone at the plant talked about. "Jackie called last night while you were in the garage," Judith said, mentioning their daughter who had moved to Indianapolis after college. "Says she can help us look at some options if." "You know." "I don't need options," Xavier said, more sharply than he'd intended. "I've got 36 years in. They're not going to close the place down just like that." He snapped his rust-stained fingers. Judith didn't argue, just sipped her coffee, eyes fixed on the window where dawn was breaking over their backyard, the winter-bare branches of the maple tree they'd planted when Jackie was born silhouetted against the pink-orange sky. Xavier ate quickly, mechanically, as he did most mornings. His lunch pail, the same black metal box his father had carried to the same plant 30 years earlier, sat on the counter, packed with last night's meatloaf sandwich, an apple, and a thermos of coffee. His father had worked at the plant for 41 years, retiring with a full pension and a gold watch in 1989, just 2 years before he died of a heart attack while mowing his lawn. Xavier had 4 more years to match his father's tenure, 4 more years to complete what felt like a sacred obligation. "I'll be late tonight," he said, standing to rinse his plate. "They've got me on a double." Again, Judith's voice carried a note of resignation. "That's the 3rd time this month." "Time and a half," Xavier shrugged. "Can't say no to that. Especially not now, with the uncertainty hanging over everything." Not that they were hurting for money, they'd always lived carefully, saving rather than spending. Their mortgage was nearly paid off. Jackie's college loans were done. They had what his father would have called a decent nest egg, but habit was habit, and Xavier had never learned to say no to extra hours. Outside, the February air bit at his face as he climbed into his truck, a 2001 Ford F-150 with 162,000 miles on it. The engine protested the cold with a grinding whine before catching. Xavier sat for a moment, waiting for the heat, watching his breath cloud in front of his face. Across the street, Jim Lawson's house sat dark and empty, foreclosure signs plastered in the windows. Jim had worked at the guide lamp plant until it closed in 2007. Last Xavier had heard, Jim and his family had moved in with relatives in Kentucky. The drive to the plant took 12 minutes in good weather. Xavier could have done it blindfolded, navigating the familiar streets of Muncie, past the high school where he'd graduated in 1973, past the shuttered Warner Gear Clubhouse where his father had taken him for company picnics as a boy, past the empty storefronts that seemed to multiply each month. Downtown Muncie wasn't what it had been in his youth. The bustling shops and crowded sidewalks had given way to vacant buildings and for-lease signs, but Xavier rarely noticed any more. The slow decline had happened so gradually that it had become normal, like watching a loved one age. The BorgWarner plant loomed ahead, a sprawling industrial complex that had been producing transmissions since 1928, when it was still Warner Gear. To Xavier, the plant had always represented permanence, a great industrial cathedral of American manufacturing. His earliest memory was sitting on his father's shoulders at a company open house, marveling at the enormous machines, the heat, the noise, the sense of importance that radiated from everything and everyone. This morning, though, something felt different as he pulled into the employee parking lot. The lot was half empty, which wasn't unusual for the day shift. Most of the workers were on second and third, but there were unfamiliar cars parked in the visitor spots near the front entrance. Black sedans with out-of-state plates. Xavier punched his time card at 6:58, 2 minutes before his shift officially began. The locker room smelled of industrial soap and the metallic tang that permeated everything at the plant. He exchanged nods with the night shift workers changing out of their work clothes, their faces gray with fatigue. Poulsen, Frank Mayers called as Xavier opened his locker. Frank was 62, counting down the months to retirement. "You hear anything?" "About what?" Xavier asked, though he knew exactly what Frank meant. "Suits are here. Big meeting in the conference room since 5 this morning." Xavier shrugged as he changed into his work clothes, heavy cotton pants, steel-toed boots, the blue work shirt with BorgWarner embroidered on the chest and Xavier stitched above the pocket. "Probably just quarterly numbers." Frank shook his head. "Not quarterly numbers. My nephew works in the front office. Says the big boss flew in from Auburn Hills last night." "Board members, too." A knot formed in Xavier's stomach, but he kept his expression neutral. "We'll find out soon enough," he said, closing his locker with a metallic clang that echoed in the now empty room. The factory floor was a world unto itself. The ceiling soared 40 feet overhead, crisscrossed with pipes and ventilation ducts. The concrete floor was worn smooth by decades of foot traffic and heavy machinery. The air vibrated with the hum and clank of production, metal on metal, the hiss of pneumatic tools, the rhythmic thud of stamping presses. It was loud enough that workers had to raise their voices to be heard, though most communicated in a kind of industrial sign language developed over years of necessity. Xavier made his way to his station in the transfer case assembly area. The transfer case, the component that delivered power to all four wheels in four-wheel drive vehicles, was one of BorgWarner's signature products. Xavier could assemble one with his eyes closed, his hands knowing exactly where each component went, how much torque each bolt required, where to check for imperfections. Mark Donovan was waiting at the station, clipboard in hand. Short and wiry, with perpetually furrowed brows, Mark had been promoted to supervisor 10 years earlier, moving from the line to management with an eagerness that some of the older workers had found distasteful. "You're late, Poulsen," Mark said, though they both knew he wasn't. "Clock says 6:58, Xavier replied, beginning his morning routine of checking his tools. "Meeting at 10:00, Mark said. "Everyone in the main assembly area, no exceptions." "What kind of meeting?" Mark's eyes flicked away. "Just be there." He turned and walked away, shoulders tight beneath his white supervisor's shirt. The knot in Xavier's stomach tightened. The morning passed in the familiar rhythm of assembly. Xavier's body moved through the motions while his mind drifted. He thought about the first car he'd owned, a '67 Mustang he'd bought with his first 6 months of wages, and restored himself. He thought about teaching Jackie to ride a bike in the cul-de-sac, how she'd been fearless even after skinning her knees. He thought about his father's hands, the same rust stains embedded in the skin, the same calluses. At 9:55 the lines shut down, an unusual occurrence in itself. Normally, production only stopped for scheduled maintenance or emergencies. The The sudden silence felt wrong, unnatural. Workers gathered in the main assembly area, clustering in familiar groups, voices hushed. Xavier stood with Frank Mayers and a few other veterans, all of them carefully not speculating about what was coming. They'd all lived through layoffs before, through production slowdowns and management changes. The auto industry had always been cyclical. At 10:00 precisely, a group of men in suits emerged onto the small platform at the front of the assembly area. Xavier recognized Tom Morris, the plant manager, looking uncharacteristically somber. Beside him stood a tall man with silver hair whom Xavier had never seen before, but whose bearing screamed executive. "That's Frederick Wilson," Frank whispered, CEO. The CEO of BorgWarner didn't come to Muncie for quarterly reports. Tom Morris stepped forward, clearing his throat. The microphone squealed briefly before he began to speak. "As you all know, the automotive industry has been facing unprecedented challenges. The economic downturn has hit our sector particularly hard. BorgWarner, like all companies, has had to make difficult decisions to ensure our long-term viability." Xavier felt the floor seemed to shift beneath him. Around him, the other workers had gone completely still. "After extensive evaluation of our manufacturing footprint, and with the goal of increasing our global competitiveness," Morris continued, reading from a prepared statement, "the decision has been made to phase out production at the Muncie transmission plant by April 2011. A collective intake of breath, like the plant itself, was gasping. "The company will work with the union to ensure a smooth transition. Severance packages will be discussed in departmental meetings throughout the week. Human resources representatives are available to answer questions about benefits and retirement options." Morris continued talking, but Xavier couldn't hear him anymore. Blood rushed in his ears, drowning out everything else. Phase out production, close the plant, end of story, end of his story. Someone was asking a question now, voice angry and tight, someone else was shouting. Xavier stood motionless, feeling the weight of decades pressing down on him. Around him, men he'd known for 30 years were reacting with shock, anger, disbelief. Frank Mayers had his head in his hands. Young Danny Wilson, who had just bought a new house for his growing family, was arguing loudly with Mark Donovan, who kept repeating, "I don't make these decisions," like a mantra. Xavier walked away. He moved through the plant as if in a dream, past the assembly lines that would soon fall silent, past the break room where he'd eaten thousands of lunches, past the wall of safety, awards the plant had accumulated over decades of operation. His feet carried him outside, into the pale February sunlight that seemed too weak to warm anything. In the parking lot, he leaned against his truck, breathing the cold air in great gulps. 2 years. They were giving them 2 years to find something else, to become someone else. Generous by industry standards, GM had closed plants with 2 weeks' notice. But what difference did it make? 2 weeks, 2 years, the result was the same. BorgWarner was leaving Muncie, and Xavier couldn't imagine what would be left when it was gone. His phone vibrated in his pocket. Judith, probably. The news would be spreading through town already. Muncie was still small enough, still connected enough. That word of the closure would travel fast. He should call her back, but he couldn't make his fingers work the phone. Not yet. Instead, he got into his truck and drove. Not home, but through the streets of Muncie, past the neighborhoods where generations of BorgWarner workers had lived, raised families, built lives on the foundation of steady work and good wages. Past Ball State University, where Jackie had earned her business degree, the first Poulsen to finish college. Past the elementary school where Xavier himself had sat at a tiny desk, drawing pictures of the factory where his dad worked, telling his teacher that's where he would work too someday. He drove until he reached Prairie Creek Reservoir, a man-made lake on the outskirts of town. In February, it was deserted, the picnic areas empty, the surface of the water gray and still. Xavier parked at a lookout point and sat watching the water, the heater in the truck running to keep the winter chill at bay. The factory had been the one constant in his life. Even when his marriage had hit rough patches, even when Jackie had gone through her rebellious teenage years, even when his parents had died within months of each other, the plant had remained. Monday to Friday, sometimes Saturday, clocking in, doing the work, clocking out. The rhythm of manufacturing had been the rhythm of his life. What would replace it? His phone vibrated again. This time he answered. "Xavier," Judith's voice was tight with concern. "Are you okay? Where are you?" "Prairie Creek," he said, his own voice sounding distant to his ears. "I heard about the announcement. It's all over the hospital." 2 years, he said. "They're giving us 2 years." A pause. Come home, Xavier. We should talk about this. What's there to talk about? It's done. It's not the end of the world, Judith said, her voice gentle but firm. We'll figure it out. We always do. But it felt like the end of the world, his world anyway. The world he had inherited from his father, the world he had expected to pass on in some form to those who came after him. A world where a man who worked with his hands could build a decent life, own a home, send his daughter to college, hold his head up in town. I'll be home later, he said, and disconnected before she could argue. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Xavier returned to the plant, sat through a departmental meeting where HR representatives distributed packets of information about severance, pension options, job retraining programs. He nodded at appropriate moments, tucked the packet into his locker without opening it, and finished his shift in a daze, his body continuing to perform the familiar tasks while his mind spun uselessly. That night he sat at the kitchen table with Judith, the packet open between them. The severance isn't bad, Judith said, reviewing the numbers, and your pension is secure. We could accelerate your retirement timeline. With my job at the hospital, we'd be okay financially. I'm 54, Xavier said. That's not retirement age. People retire early all the time, Judith said, or you could do something else. The packet mentions retraining programs, community college courses even. Xavier laughed, a short, bitter sound. Go back to school at my age to learn what? Computers. I can barely use the one Jackie gave us last Christmas. There are other options, Judith persisted. Construction, security work. The hospital always needs maintenance people. I'm not a maintenance person. I build transfer cases. You won't be building them here anymore, Judith said, then immediately looked apologetic. I'm sorry, I didn't mean. It's the truth, Xavier said, pushing back from the table. No point dancing around it. BorgWarner is leaving Muncie, and men like me are getting left behind. You're not being left behind, Judith said, reaching for his hand. The world is changing, that's all. We need to change with it. But that was the problem. Xavier didn't know how to change, didn't know who he was if not a BorgWarner man. His identity had been forged in that factory, shaped by the work he did there, by the pride he took in being part of something enduring. If that was gone, what remained? The weeks following the announcement took on a surreal quality. The plant continued to operate, but a sense of inevitable decline colored everything. No overtime was approved. Maintenance on the machines became perfunctory. The vending machines in the break room weren't restocked when they emptied, small signs of abandonment accumulating like dust. Muncie itself seemed to slump under the weight of the news. BorgWarner employed 780 people directly, not as many as in its heyday, but still enough to impact the local economy significantly. The Muncie Star Press ran front-page stories about the closure, interviewing economists who estimated that for every job lost at the plant, another 3.5 jobs would disappear from the community. Xavier read these stories with a growing sense of disconnection. The economist quotes and political statements seemed to have nothing to do with the reality he was experiencing, the hollow feeling in his chest when he drove through the factory gates each morning, knowing that each entry moved him closer to his final exit. At home, tensions rose as Xavier resisted Judith's attempts to plan for the future. He refused to look at job listings she circled in the newspaper, ignored the brochures from Ivy Tech Community College that appeared on the kitchen counter. You can't just pretend this isn't happening, Judith finally said one evening, frustration breaking through her usual patience. I'm not pretending anything, Xavier responded, not looking up from the TV where a basketball game played unwatched. I'm just not ready to become someone else yet. No one's asking you to become someone else, just to consider what comes next. 2 years, he said. They gave us 2 years. I don't need to figure it all out tonight. But as the weeks passed, it became clear that 2 years was an optimistic timeline. Orders for transmissions were declining faster than projected. Shifts were reduced. The third shift was eliminated entirely in April, with those workers either moved to earlier shifts or laid off, depending on seniority. In May, just 3 months after the closure announcement, Tom Morris called another all-hands meeting. Due to accelerating market conditions, he announced, looking even more haggard than before, the phase-out timeline has been revised. The plant will now cease operations by April 2010. 1 year, not 2. The revised severance packages were distributed that afternoon. That evening, Xavier sat in his garage, a can of beer in his hand, surrounded by the accumulated tools and projects of decades. The garage had always been his refuge, the place where he retreated when the world became too much, where he could lose himself in the tangible problems of mechanical things. But tonight, even the garage felt alien, as if it too were slipping away from him. His phone rang. Jackie, calling from Indianapolis. "Hey, Dad," she said, her voice carefully upbeat. "Mom told me about the revised timeline." "I'm sorry." "Not your fault," Xavier said. "I've been thinking, you know that Dave's company is always looking for experienced manufacturing people. It's not exactly what you do now, but it's similar. And Indianapolis isn't that far." Dave was Jackie's boyfriend, an engineer at a medical device company. Xavier had met him twice and found him pleasant enough, if a bit too eager to share his opinions on everything from politics to proper grilling techniques. "I appreciate that, sweetheart, but I'm not moving to Indianapolis." "It was just an idea," Jackie said. "I'm worried about you, that's all." "I'm fine," Xavier said automatically, the response he gave to any inquiry about his well-being, just processing everything. "Mom says you won't talk about it, about what comes next." Xavier sighed. "Your mother and I have different approaches to problems. She wants to solve everything immediately. I need time to think." "There might not be much time, Dad. Good jobs are hard to find, especially for old factory workers without college degrees," Xavier finished for her. "Is that what you were going to say?" "That's not fair," Jackie said, hurt evident in her voice. "I'm trying to help." "I know," Xavier softened. "I know you are, but I don't need rescuing, Jackie. I need to figure this out myself." After they hung up, Xavier remained in the garage, listening to the familiar night sounds of the neighborhood, a dog barking a few houses down, the distant rumble of a motorcycle on the main road, the hum of his refrigerator where he kept his beer cold. This garage, this house, this street, it had been his entire world for decades. The thought of leaving it behind, of starting over somewhere else, made him physically ill, but staying meant what? The few factories still operating in Muncie were themselves struggling, unlikely to hire a 54-year-old assembly worker. Retail jobs paid a fraction of his current wages. The pension would help, but it wasn't enough to live on, not really, not unless they drastically changed their lifestyle. For the first time, Xavier allowed himself to feel the fear that had been lurking beneath his anger and denial. Fear not just of economic hardship, but of purposelessness. Of waking up each morning without somewhere to go, something to build, some contribution to make. The next day at the plant, Xavier sought out Frank Mayers during lunch break. Frank was sitting alone, methodically eating a sandwich, a retirement planning guide open next to his lunch pail. "Thinking of taking the package?" Xavier asked, sitting across from him. Frank nodded. "Makes sense for me. I'm close enough to retirement age that the numbers work out. Caroline and I have been talking about moving down to Tennessee anyway, be closer to the grandkids." "You're just going to leave Muncie?" "Just like that." Frank looked up, surprised at Xavier's tone. "It's not just like that. We've been thinking about it for years. The plant closing just moves the timeline up." He studied Xavier's face. "You're really struggling with this, aren't you?" Xavier shrugged, uncomfortable with the direct question. "You know," Frank continued, "my father lost his job at the steel mill in Gary when I was a kid. I remember how hard it hit him. He was a lot like you, defined himself by that job. Took him 2 years to find steady work again, and he was never the same." "That's encouraging," Xavier said sarcastically. "Let me finish." He was never the same because he couldn't let go of who he thought he was supposed to be, kept trying to find exactly the same job, the same life, turned down opportunities because they didn't fit his image of himself. Frank closed his retirement guide. "Don't make that mistake, Xavier. You're more than what you do for 8 hours a day." Xavier wanted to argue, to defend the importance of the work they did, the value of constancy and loyalty, but the words stuck in his throat. Was Frank right? Had he allowed his identity to become so entangled with BorgWarner that he couldn't imagine himself apart from it? That afternoon, instead of going straight home, Xavier drove to the public library. He hadn't been inside since helping Jackie with a research project in high school, and the building had been renovated since then, the interior brighter and more modern than he remembered. At the information desk, a young librarian with pink-streaked hair and multiple ear piercings looked up from her computer. Can I help you find something? Xavier hesitated. I'm looking for information on job retraining programs for manufacturing workers. If the librarian found his request unusual, she didn't show it. We have a whole section on career development. I can show you where it is. We also have computers where you can access online job boards and training resources. I'm not great with computers, Xavier admitted. We offer basic computer literacy classes twice a week, she said, standing to lead him to the appropriate section. They're free, and we have volunteers who can help with job searches, resume writing, that sort of thing. Xavier followed her to a shelf lined with books on career changes, interview techniques, and skill development. It was overwhelming, but also unexpectedly, a tiny bit intriguing. He'd never considered that the library might be a resource for someone like him. He checked out 3 books, feeling self-conscious as he presented his long-unused library card and drove home with them on the passenger seat, as if they were fragile objects that might detonate if jostled. Judith looked up in surprise when he placed them on the kitchen table. You went to the library. Thought I should start looking at options, Xavier said, trying to sound casual. The relief and pleasure on Judith's face made him realize how worried she had been. That's great, she said, examining the titles. I think that's really great, Xavier. Don't get too excited. I'm just reading, not making any decisions. Reading is a start, she said, squeezing his arm. That night, Xavier lay in bed next to Judith, listening to her steady breathing as she slept. The house creaked and settled around them, familiar sounds that had formed the soundtrack of their life together. He thought about Frank's father, unable to adapt, and about his own father, who had never faced the challenge of reinvention. Arthur Poulsen had walked through the same factory gates for 41 years, his identity and purpose never in question. Perhaps that was the real legacy his father had left him, not just the example of loyalty and hard work, but an unspoken belief that a man was defined by his consistency, by doing the same valuable thing day after day, year after year. What happened when that was no longer possible? As spring turned to summer, the atmosphere at the plant grew increasingly tense. Production schedules were unpredictable. Equipment was being tagged for removal to other facilities. Each week, it seemed another familiar face disappeared, either laid off or having taken early retirement. Xavier threw himself into work with grim determination, as if by performing each task perfectly, he could somehow stave off the inevitable. At home, he began to spend evenings at the kitchen table with his library books, making notes, occasionally asking Judith questions about healthcare jobs, since the hospital was one of the few growing employers in Muncie. They always need people in maintenance and facilities, Judith would say. It's not glamorous, but it's steady work with good benefits. Xavier would nod, make another note, and return to his reading. He wasn't enthusiastic, but he was engaged, which Judith counted as progress. In July, the first major piece of equipment was removed from the plant, a massive stamping press that had been installed in the 1950s. It took 3 days to disassemble it, the sound of metal being cut and unbolted creating a cacophony that made normal conversation impossible. Xavier watched from his station as the components were loaded onto flatbed trucks bound for Mexico, where they would be reassembled in a newer, more modern facility. There goes 50 years of American manufacturing, Frank commented, standing next to Xavier as the last truck pulled away. Xavier nodded, a lump in his throat. The space where the press had stood was now just an empty rectangle on the factory floor, the concrete a different shade where it had been protected from wear for decades. That weekend, a Sunday in late July, Xavier was in the backyard mowing the lawn when he felt a strange pressure in his chest. At first he ignored it, indigestion, he thought, from the spicy chili Judith had made the night before. But as he continued pushing the mower in neat lines across the grass, the pressure intensified, radiating down his left arm, up into his jaw. He stopped, leaning on the mower, sweat beading on his forehead despite the shade of the maple tree. The pain was impossible to ignore now, crushing and insistent. He tried to call for Judith, but couldn't make his voice work properly. His last conscious thought before collapsing was oddly practical. I didn't finish the lawn. He woke in the cardiac care unit at Ball Memorial Hospital, Judith asleep in a chair beside his bed, her hand clutching his. A heart attack, the doctor explained when he made his rounds. A significant one, but caught in time to prevent the worst damage. Xavier would recover, but he would need to make changes: medication, dietary adjustments, a cardiac rehabilitation program, stress reduction. Stress reduction, Xavier repeated. That's a good one. The doctor, a young man who looked to Xavier barely old enough to be out of high school, frowned. I'm serious, Mr. Poulsen. Stress is a major contributor to heart disease. You need to find ways to manage it. My plant is closing. I'm losing my job of 36 years. I'm a 54-year-old factory worker with a high school diploma. How exactly do you suggest I reduce my stress? The words came out sharper than Xavier had intended, born of fear and the lingering effects of medications. I understand you're facing significant life changes, the doctor said, unperturbed. That's all the more reason to prioritize your health. We have excellent support resources, counseling, support groups for cardiac patients, meditation classes. Xavier nearly laughed at the thought of himself in a meditation class, sitting cross-legged on a mat, trying to clear his mind. But the serious expression on the doctor's face and the fear in Judith's eyes when she woke to hear the tail end of the conversation stopped him. I'll think about it, he said instead. The heart attack changed things. It made the abstract threat to Xavier's future suddenly, painfully concrete. He spent 5 days in the hospital, with plenty of time to think. Judith was there every day, having arranged for colleagues to cover some of her shifts. Jackie drove up from Indianapolis twice, bringing flowers and magazines and worry etched on her young face. On the third day, Mark Donovan from the plant came to visit, uncomfortable in the hospital setting, but determined to do the right thing by a longtime employee. Everyone sends their best, Mark said, standing awkwardly at the foot of the bed, a card signed by Xavier's department clutched in his hand. We're holding your spot until you're cleared to come back. How long will that spot exist? Xavier asked. Mark looked away. We're still on schedule for the April closure, but you've got sick leave and short-term disability if you need it. After Mark left, Xavier lay staring at the ceiling, the reality of his situation crystallizing with new clarity. Even if he returned to work, and the doctor was suggesting at least 6 weeks of recovery, he would only be going back to a job that was disappearing. And now he had a health condition to manage, medications to pay for, lifestyle changes to implement. The path forward, which had seemed so murky before, began to take shape in his mind, not because it had become easier, but because the alternative had become unthinkable. He had to change to adapt, not just for himself, but for Judith, for Jackie, for the future that suddenly seemed both more precious and more precarious. On his last day in the hospital, as he was preparing to be discharged, a social worker came to his room with information about cardiac rehabilitation programs and support services. We also have resources for employment transition, she said, having been briefed on his situation. There's a special program for displaced manufacturing workers actually. It's run through the WorkOne Center downtown. I'll look into it, Xavier said, and for the first time he meant it. The heart attack became a dividing line in Xavier's life, a clear demarcation between before and after. Before, he had been resisting change, clinging to an identity and a way of life that was slipping away. After, he was forced to confront not just the economic realities of the plant closure, but his own mortality. During his recovery at home, he began to take small steps. He enrolled in the cardiac rehabilitation program, where he learned exercises appropriate for his condition and met other men and women dealing with similar health challenges. Many of them, he discovered, were former or current manufacturing workers, their bodies bearing the evidence of decades of physical labor and stress. He started attending a job transition program at WorkOne, where employment specialists helped him identify transferable skills and explore options that wouldn't be too physically demanding. To his surprise, he discovered that his years at BorgWarner had given him abilities beyond just assembling transfer cases. He had developed problem-solving skills, attention to detail, an understanding of mechanical systems, and the ability to work as part of a team. The process wasn't easy. There were days when frustration overwhelmed him, when the learning curve of new skills seemed too steep, when the future looked bleak despite his efforts. On those days, he would retreat to his garage, tinker with his tools, find comfort in the familiar work of his hands, but there were also moments of unexpected discovery. In a computer literacy class at the library, he found that he enjoyed the logical progression of learning new software, the satisfaction of mastering a skill that had seemed impossibly foreign. In conversations with younger workers at the transition center, he found himself offering insights and perspectives they valued. In September, Xavier returned to BorgWarner on restricted duty, no heavy lifting, shorter shifts. The plant had changed dramatically in the 2 months he'd been gone. Whole sections were now empty, the equipment shipped to other facilities. The workforce had been reduced further, with many taking early retirement or finding jobs elsewhere rather than waiting for the final closure. Frank Mayers was gone, having taken the retirement package and moved to Tennessee as planned. Mark Donovan looked increasingly stressed, his future with the company uncertain. The camaraderie that had once defined life on the factory floor had been replaced by a somber resignation, each worker focused on their own survival. Xavier worked methodically, doing what was required but no longer finding the same satisfaction in the tasks. The heart attack had severed something essential in his connection to the place, not his pride in the work itself, but his belief that the work defined him completely. In October, he applied for a position in the facilities maintenance department at Ball Memorial Hospital. The job would involve routine repairs, equipment maintenance, and general upkeep, not entirely unlike aspects of what he'd done at the plant, though in a very different environment. The pay was less than he'd made at BorgWarner, but combined with his partial pension, it would be enough. And the health insurance was excellent, a crucial consideration given his new medical needs. To his surprise, he was called for an interview. Judith helped him prepare, coaching him on questions to expect, helping him articulate his experience in terms that would translate to a healthcare setting. "Just be yourself," she advised as he dressed for the interview, wearing a tie for the first time since Jackie's college graduation. "They'd be lucky to have you." The interview was conducted by a facilities manager named Robert Garcia and an HR representative, whose name Xavier immediately forgot in his nervousness. They asked about his experience with different types of equipment, his approach to preventative maintenance, his comfort level working in an environment where patient care was the priority. Xavier answered honestly, acknowledging what he didn't know but emphasizing his willingness to learn. He spoke about his attention to detail, his reliability, his ability to troubleshoot problems. When asked about his health, a question that might have been inappropriate in another context but seemed reasonable for a physical job, he was straightforward about his heart attack and the changes he'd made since. "I'm actually healthier now than I was before," he said, "more aware of what my body needs, more careful about how I work." 2 days later, he received a call offering him the position, contingent on a background check and drug test. The start date would be December 1st, a month before BorgWarner's operations in Muncie would be reduced to a skeleton crew handling the final equipment removal. That evening, Xavier and Judith sat on their back porch, watching the sunset paint the October sky in shades of orange and purple. The maple tree, now ablaze with autumn colors, cast long shadows across the yard. "I'm proud of you," Judith said, her hand finding his. "I know how hard this has been." Xavier nodded, his throat tight with emotion. "I keep thinking about my dad. What he would make of all this." "He'd be proud too," Judith said confidently. "He valued work, yes, but he valued family more. He'd be glad you're taking care of yourself, finding a way forward." "It's not the same, though," Xavier said. "The hospital job, it's not the same as the plant." "No," Judith agreed. "It's not the same, but different doesn't have to mean worse." Xavier considered this. For so long, he had equated change with loss, loss of identity, loss of purpose, loss of the world he had known and understood. But sitting here with Judith beside him, with a new job ahead and his health improving, he began to see that change could also mean continuation. A different form, perhaps, but not an end. "I'm going to miss it," he admitted. "The plant, the work." "I know," Judith said simply. In November, BorgWarner held a recognition ceremony for employees with more than 30 years of service who would not be continuing with the company at other locations. Xavier received a plaque commemorating his 36 years, presented by Tom Morris in the same assembly area where the closure had been announced 9 months earlier. The ceremony was subdued, perfunctory. Corporate representatives made speeches about legacy and contribution that rang hollow in the half-empty factory. Afterwards, employees gathered in the break room for cake and coffee, exchanging contact information and promises to stay in touch that everyone knew would be difficult to keep. Xavier stood at the edge of the gathering, the plaque heavy in his hands. The engraved text thanked him for his dedicated service and commitment to excellence, standard corporate language that failed to capture what those 36 years had actually meant. Not just work but a way of life, not just a paycheck but a purpose, not just colleagues but a community, Mark Donovan approached, coffee cup in hand. "Congratulations on the hospital job," he said. "Heard from Frank that you'd landed on your feet." Xavier nodded, "Starting in December. How about you? Any plans?" Mark grimaced. "They've offered me a position in Auburn Hills, corporate quality control, more money, but," he shrugged. "Michigan uprooting the family. You'll take it, though." "Don't have much choice, do I? Jobs like mine don't exactly grow on trees around here anymore." Xavier understood. For all his complaints about management, Mark was in the same boat as the rest of them, trying to navigate a changing landscape with limited options. The difference was that Mark had a transferable skill set, a college degree, and 20 fewer years invested in Muncie. "Good luck," Xavier said, and meant it. On November 30th, Xavier worked his final shift at BorgWarner. The plant was a shadow of itself now, production down to a single line running at half capacity, most of the equipment already gone. He moved through his duties with a strange detachment, as if he were already a visitor rather than an employee. At the end of the shift, he cleaned out his locker, 36 years of accumulated items reduced to a small box. Work gloves worn to the shape of his hands, a coffee mug stained by years of use, a faded photograph of Judith and Jackie at a company picnic, circa 1990. A pocket knife his father had given him on his first day. He turned in his badge to security, nodded to the few remaining colleagues still working the line, and walked out through the employee entrance one last time. In the parking lot, he paused to look back at the sprawling complex that had been the center of his working life. The BorgWarner logo still stood atop the main building, illuminated against the November sky, but it seemed smaller somehow, less permanent than it once had. Xavier drove home slowly, the box of his belongings on the passenger seat. The streets of Muncie were decorated for the upcoming holidays, Christmas lights strung along storefronts, a large tree erected in the courthouse square. The city continued its rhythms despite the impending loss of one of its major employers, despite the uncertainty facing hundreds of families. At home, Judith had prepared a special dinner to mark the occasion, Xavier's favorite pot roast, the good wine they usually saved for anniversaries. They ate quietly, the significance of the day heavy between them. "How does it feel?" Judith finally asked. Xavier considered the question. "Strange," he said eventually, "like the end of something important." But also, he struggled to articulate the complex emotions. "Also like taking off a heavy coat I didn't realize was weighing me down." Judith reached across the table to squeeze his hand, understanding in her eyes. Later, after dinner, Xavier went to the garage and carefully unpacked the box from his locker. Each item found a new place, the gloves hung on a peg, the mug on his workbench, the photograph tucked into the frame of the pegboard where he kept his tools. The pocket knife he slipped into his pocket, where it would remain. On December 1st, Xavier began his new job at Ball Memorial Hospital. The facilities department was located in the basement, a maze of corridors and mechanical rooms that serviced the sprawling medical complex above. His supervisor, Robert Garcia, spent the morning showing him around, introducing him to colleagues, explaining the basic systems he would be responsible for maintaining. It was overwhelming, the unfamiliar environment, the new faces, the different rhythms of a hospital compared to a factory. By lunchtime, Xavier's head was swimming with information, and his confidence was faltering. He sat alone in the employee cafeteria, picking at a sandwich, wondering if he'd made a terrible mistake. "Mind if I join you?" A woman's voice interrupted his thoughts. Xavier looked up to see Judith standing there, her hospital ID badge hanging around her neck, a salad in her hands. "What are you doing here?" he asked, surprised. Her office was in another building on the campus. "Thought you might like some company on your first day," she said, sitting across from him. "How's it going so far?" "It's a lot," Xavier admitted, "different from what I'm used to." "First days always are," Judith said practically. "Remember how overwhelmed I was when I started here? I got lost trying to find the bathroom and ended up in radiology." Xavier smiled at the memory. "I've already got lost twice, and it's only noon." "You'll get the hang of it," Judith assured him. "And you've got an advantage. You've already got a friend who knows the place." As they ate, Judith pointed out various hospital employees in the cafeteria, giving Xavier a brief rundown of the different departments, the hierarchy, the unwritten rules of the place. By the time lunch was over, the knot of anxiety in his chest had loosened slightly. He could do this. It would take time, but he could learn this new world, just as he had learned the factory decades ago. The afternoon went more smoothly. Xavier shadowed Mike Reeves, a maintenance technician who had been at the hospital for 15 years, as they fixed a leaking pipe in the laundry facility and replaced ballasts in fluorescent lights in a hallway. The work itself was straightforward, familiar enough in its basics that Xavier could focus on learning the specific protocols of the hospital setting. By the end of the day, exhausted but satisfied, Xavier returned to the facility's office to clock out. Robert was there reviewing work orders for the next day. "How'd it go?" he asked, looking up from his computer. "Better as the day went on," Xavier answered honestly. "Mike was helpful." Robert nodded. "First week is always the hardest. It gets easier," he hesitated, then added, "I know it's a big change from BorgWarner. Different type of work, different environment, but we're glad to have someone with your experience." The simple acknowledgement that the transition was significant, that Xavier's previous career had value, meant more than Robert could know. "Thanks for the opportunity," Xavier said. "I'll see you tomorrow." As he drove home that evening, Xavier felt the familiar ache in his shoulders and back from a day of physical work, but it was accompanied by a new sensation, a kind of tentative optimism that had been absent for months. He wasn't the same man who had walked through the BorgWarner gates as a teenager, not anymore, but perhaps he didn't need to be. December passed in a blur of new routines and holiday preparations. Xavier gradually adjusted to the rhythms of the hospital, learning its systems and protocols, becoming familiar with its geography. The work was varied, one day fixing a broken toilet, the next repairing an air handling unit, the next installing new shelving in a supply closet. It lacked the focused repetition of factory work, but that variety brought its own satisfactions. He began to know his colleagues, Mike Reeves, who had taken Xavier under his wing; Sarah Chen, the young engineer who managed the building systems; Darnell Washington, a fellow maintenance technician who had previously worked at one of the glass factories that had closed in the 1990s. They were different from his BorgWarner colleagues in many ways, but similar in others, working people taking pride in doing necessary jobs well. At home, Judith noticed the changes in her husband. The tension that had been a constant companion since the closure announcement had eased. He still had moments of frustration and nostalgia, still spoke of BorgWarner with a mixture of pride and pain, but he was engaging with his new reality rather than resisting it. Christmas brought Jackie home from Indianapolis, along with Dave, now her fiancé. They announced their engagement on Christmas Eve, presenting Judith with a photo album of wedding ideas and asking if she would help with the planning. "And Dad," Jackie said, turning to Xavier, "Dave's dad isn't really in the picture, so I was hoping you might help him with some of the traditional father-of-the-groom stuff. Tux shopping, bachelor party planning, that kind of thing." Xavier was touched by the request, by his daughter's thoughtfulness in finding ways to include him in a celebration that might otherwise have emphasized his peripheral role in her Indianapolis life. "I'd be honored," he said, and meant it, "though I'm not sure how much help I'll be with bachelor party planning. Last one I attended was in 1983, and it mainly involved fishing and too much beer." Jackie laughed. "That actually sounds perfect for Dave. He hates clubs." The engagement added a note of joy to a season that might otherwise have been dominated by the impending final closure of the BorgWarner plant. On February 28, 2010, the last transmission was scheduled to roll off the assembly line, marking the official end of production in Muncie. Former employees were invited to attend a small ceremony commemorating the occasion. Xavier debated whether to go. Part of him wanted to be there, to witness the end of an era that had defined not just his life but the life of the city. Another part recoiled from the thought of watching the last moments of a place that had meant so much to him. In the end, he decided to attend. Not going felt like denying an important part of his own history, like refusing to acknowledge a death in the family out of pain or pride. The ceremony was brief and subdued. About 100 former employees gathered in the now mostly empty main assembly area. The final transmission, a transfer case for a Ford F-150, was completed with a small ceremony, the last worker placing the final component with cameras recording the moment for corporate archives. Tom Morris made a speech about legacy and community contribution that sounded eerily similar to the one he'd made at the recognition ceremony in November. Afterwards, people lingered, taking photos, sharing memories, some openly weeping. Xavier moved through the crowd, exchanging greetings with former colleagues, many of whom he hadn't seen since his own departure. Some had found other jobs in manufacturing, commuting to Anderson or Indianapolis. Others had retrained for different fields. A few, like Frank Mayers, had retired. All seemed to be carrying the same mix of nostalgia and resignation that Xavier felt. Mark Donovan was there, back from Auburn Hills for the occasion. He looked different, more polished in his corporate attire, but also more strained. "How's Michigan?" Xavier asked when they crossed paths. "Cold," Mark said with a tight smile. "Different, the corporate office is." "Not like here," he gestured vaguely at the factory floor. "How's the hospital treating you?" "Good," Xavier said. "Different too, but good, I'm learning." They stood in awkward silence for a moment, two men who had worked alongside each other for decades, now separated by more than just job titles. "They're going to demolish most of it," Mark finally said. "Keep the newer sections for warehousing, but the original buildings, where we worked, all coming down this summer." Xavier nodded, unsurprised but still pained by the news. The physical erasure of the plant seemed a final insult, a statement that not even the memory of what had happened here was worth preserving. "Progress, I guess," he said without conviction. After the ceremony, Xavier didn't go directly home. Instead, he drove through Muncie, taking a long route that passed by landmarks of his life: the high school, the park where he and Judith had picnicked as newlyweds, the first house they had rented before buying their current home. The city had changed over the decades, stores coming and going, neighborhoods rising or declining, but its essential character remained. Muncie had been built on manufacturing: automotive components at BorgWarner and Delco Battery, glass at Ball Brothers, steel at Indiana Steel and Wire. One by one, these industries had contracted or departed, leaving the city searching for a new identity, a new economic foundation. Ball State University had grown, the hospital system had expanded, but neither could fully replace the solid middle-class jobs that the factories had once provided. Xavier wondered what Muncie would become in the decades ahead. Would it find a new purpose, a new source of prosperity? Or would it continue to shrink, its younger residents departing for opportunities elsewhere, its remaining population aging in place amidst the ghosts of former industry? He had no answers, but as he drove past Ball Memorial Hospital, his new workplace, he felt a small surge of pride. He was still here, still contributing, still part of whatever Muncie would become. That counted for something. At home, Judith was waiting, aware of what day it was and what it meant to Xavier. "How was it?" she asked as he came through the door. "Sad," he said simply, "but I'm glad I went. Needed to see it one last time." That night, Xavier dreamed of the factory as it had been in its prime: the floors bustling with workers, the machines operating at full capacity, the air filled with the sounds and smells of production. In the dream, he moved through the familiar spaces with a sense of belonging, knowing exactly where he was and what he was meant to do. When he woke, the loss felt fresh again, a hollow space in his chest that ached with each heartbeat. But as he rose and prepared for his shift at the hospital, the ache began to subside, replaced by the practical considerations of the day ahead. There was a broken HVAC unit in the pediatric ward that needed attention, a new equipment installation in radiology that he would be assisting with, a training session on the updated safety protocols for handling medical waste. Real work that needed doing, work that mattered. As spring arrived, Xavier settled further into his new routine. He found unexpected satisfaction in the hospital environment, the knowledge that his work contributed, however indirectly, to patient care. When he repaired lighting in a hallway or fixed a door that wouldn't close properly, he was making the environment better for people who were sick, vulnerable, in need of comfort. There was meaning in that. He also discovered that his decades of manufacturing experience gave him insights and skills that were valuable in his new role. His methodical approach to troubleshooting, his understanding of mechanical systems, his attention to detail, all transferred well to facilities maintenance. More than once, Robert had commented on Xavier's ability to identify the root cause of a problem that had stumped others. In April, on what would have been the one-year anniversary of the original BorgWarner closure timeline, Xavier took a day off work and drove to Prairie Creek Reservoir, the same spot where he had sat after the closure announcement. The day was warm, spring well underway, the lake's surface rippled by a gentle breeze. He parked in the same lookout point and sat watching the water, reflecting on the year that had passed, the heart attack, the end of his time at the plant. The beginning of his job at the hospital, Jackie's engagement, the final closure of BorgWarner Muncie. So much change in such a compressed period, more than he had experienced in decades prior. He thought about the man he had been a year ago, resistant to change, fearful of what lay beyond the familiar rhythms of the plant, his identity so thoroughly intertwined with his job that the loss of one threatened the extinction of the other. That man seemed distant now, a version of himself that Xavier could recognize but no longer fully inhabited. The heart attack had forced him to confront his mortality, to acknowledge that the body he had taken for granted, the body that had allowed him to perform physically demanding work day after day, year after year, was vulnerable, finite. The plant closure had forced him to confront a different kind of mortality, the end of an industrial era, the disappearance of a way of life that had seemed permanent. Both confrontations had been painful, disorienting. But both had also been clarifying, stripping away assumptions and habits to reveal what truly mattered: his health, his family, his capacity to adapt and continue. As he sat by the lake, Xavier reached into his pocket and withdrew his father's pocket knife, the one Arthur Poulsen had given him on his first day at BorgWarner. He opened it, tested the blade with his thumb, feeling its familiar weight in his hand. He had carried it every day for 36 years, a talisman connecting him to his father and to the work they had shared. For a moment he considered throwing it into the lake, a symbolic severing of ties with the past, a dramatic gesture of moving on, but that felt wrong, a rejection rather than an integration. Instead, he closed the knife and returned it to his pocket, where it belonged. The past wasn't something to discard, but something to carry forward, to incorporate into whatever came next. Xavier started the truck and began the drive back to Muncie. As he approached the city, he took a detour to drive past the BorgWarner plant one more time. The main building still stood, awaiting demolition, but the parking lot was empty, the windows dark, the grounds untended. Already it looked abandoned, a relic rather than a living enterprise. He allowed himself a moment of grief for what had been lost, not just his job, but a way of life, a type of work, a sense of permanence that had anchored not only him, but generations of workers in Muncie and countless similar cities across America. The loss was real and significant, deserving of acknowledgement and remembrance. But as he turned toward home, toward Judith, toward the life they were continuing to build together despite the changes around them, Xavier felt something unexpected. A sense of possibility, not optimism exactly, not in the face of economic realities that remained challenging for Muncie and for manufacturing workers everywhere. But a recognition that the end of one story didn't mean the end of all stories, that he could carry the values of his working life, diligence, craftsmanship, community, into new contexts. That his identity was both more durable and more adaptable than he had believed. In June, the demolition of the original BorgWarner buildings began. Xavier didn't go to watch, but he followed the progress in the Muncie Star Press, which ran a photo series documenting the dismantling of what had once been one of the city's industrial anchors. The images were difficult to see, walls crumbling, steel beams exposed, the familiar silhouette of the plant gradually erased from the landscape, but life continued. Jackie and Dave set their wedding date for October. Xavier's cardiac checkups showed continued improvement. Judith was promoted to a supervisory position in the hospital billing department. At work, Xavier was given more responsibilities, including training new maintenance staff and participating in planning for a renovation of the emergency department. In July, Frank Mayers and his wife Caroline came back to Muncie for a visit, staying with friends and catching up with former colleagues. Xavier and Judith had them over for dinner one evening, grilling in the backyard as the summer sun lingered late in the sky. "How's Tennessee treating you?" Xavier asked as they sat on the patio, beers in hand. "Can't complain," Frank said. "Weather's better, cost of living's lower, and being close to the grandkids." He smiled. "That makes everything worthwhile. Miss anything about Muncie?" Frank considered the question. Friends mostly, some of the restaurants, the familiarity of knowing every street, every neighborhood. He took a sip of his beer. "But I don't miss the worry, the constant wondering if this would be the year the plant finally closed, that wait." Xavier nodded, understanding exactly what Frank meant. That wait had been a constant companion for so many years that its absence was still occasionally startling, like a phantom limb. "How about you?" Frank asked. "Hospital working out?" "Better than I expected," Xavier admitted. "Different kind of work, different pace, but good people, meaningful contribution." He paused, then added, "I don't wake up dreading the day." "That's something." Frank nodded. "That's a lot, actually." Later, as the two couples sat around the patio table sharing dessert, Caroline asked about the site of the former plant. "What are they going to do with the land once the demolition is complete?" "Part of it's being redeveloped as a logistics center," Xavier explained. "Warehousing, distribution, that sort of thing. Some of it will probably sit empty for years. That's what happened with the Delco site. Some jobs, at least, Frank commented, though warehouse work isn't the same. No, Xavier agreed. Lower wages, fewer benefits, less stability, different world now. There was a moment of shared silence as they all contemplated the transformation not just of Muncie, but of the economic landscape across America. Manufacturing jobs, once the backbone of middle-class prosperity, the pathway to home ownership and college education for children, had been replaced by service work, healthcare, logistics, retail. Some of these new jobs offered opportunities, but many represented a step down in wages, benefits, and security. You know what I think about sometimes, Frank said, breaking the silence, our fathers. How different their experience was from ours. They came of age during the Depression, fought in the war, then came home to the most prosperous period in American history. Factory jobs with good wages, strong unions, companies that expected you to stay for life. And believed they had some responsibility to the communities where they operated, Xavier added. Exactly. My father used to say he was lucky to have been born when he was, lucky to have found steady work, lucky to have raised his family during those boom decades. I didn't really understand what he meant until recently. Xavier thought about his own father, Arthur Poulsen, who had indeed been fortunate in his timing, entering the workforce as manufacturing was expanding, benefiting from strong union contracts and corporate growth, retiring just before the major contractions began. Arthur had worked hard, certainly, but he had also worked in an economic context that rewarded that hard work with stability and gradual advancement. Xavier's generation had straddled the divide, beginning their careers during the tail end of industrial prosperity, then watching as factories closed, jobs moved overseas, and the social contract between companies and workers eroded. They had been taught to expect one kind of working life and had ended up experiencing another. I wonder what it will be like for our grandchildren, Caroline mused. What kind of work they'll do, what kind of lives they'll build. Different from ours, that's for sure, Judith said. Jackie and Dave talk about work in ways I barely understand sometimes. Remote collaboration, digital platforms, constant retraining. Adaptation, Xavier said, the word coming to him suddenly. That's what it comes down to, isn't it? Our parents adapted to their time. We adapted to ours, even if it was harder than we expected. The kids will adapt to whatever comes next. Frank raised his glass, to adaptation then. And to remembering what came before. They all drank to that, a toast to the past they had shared and the futures they were navigating separately. In October, Xavier stood in the vestibule of a church in Indianapolis, adjusting his tie as he prepared to walk Jackie down the aisle. His daughter looked radiant in her wedding dress, her face a blend of excitement and nervous anticipation. You look beautiful, he told her, his throat tight with emotion. Dave is a lucky man. Thanks, Dad, Jackie said, squeezing his hand, for everything, not just today, but for being the kind of father who showed me what hard work and commitment look like. For supporting me even when my choices weren't what you expected. Xavier thought about his initial resistance to Jackie's move to Indianapolis, his disappointment when she'd chosen business school instead of returning to Muncie. How short-sighted he'd been, how trapped in his own assumptions about what success and loyalty looked like. I'm proud of you, he said simply, of who you've become, of the life you're building. As the music began and they started their walk down the aisle, Xavier felt a swell of emotions, pride in his daughter, gratitude for the years he and Judith had been given together, a bittersweet awareness of how quickly time passed. Jackie's hand rested on his arm, warm and reassuring, connecting him to the future even as he carried the past with him. Later, at the reception, Xavier found himself talking with Dave's uncle, a professor at Purdue University who specialized in economic history. Jackie tells me you worked at BorgWarner before it closed, the professor said. I've been studying the impact of deindustrialization on Midwestern communities. Would you mind sharing your perspective? Once Xavier might have bristled at being treated as a case study, an example of economic disruption rather than an individual with agency and dignity. But now he recognized the value in his experience, the insights it might offer. It's a complicated story, Xavier said, not just job losses, though those were significant. It was about identity, about the relationship between work and self-worth, about what happens when the foundations you've built your life on start to crumble. They talked for nearly an hour, Xavier describing the gradual decline of manufacturing in Muncie, the impact on families and neighborhoods, the challenge of reinvention in middle age. The professor listened intently, occasionally asking questions but mostly allowing Xavier to tell his story in his own words. "You know what's striking to me," the professor said eventually, "your resilience. The ability to absorb that kind of disruption and find a way forward. Not everyone manages that transition successfully." Xavier thought about the men he knew who hadn't adapted, who had fallen into depression or alcoholism, who had never found meaningful work again, who had become bitter or withdrawn. He had come close to that path himself, might have followed it if not for the heart attack that had forced him to confront his situation with new clarity. "I had help," Xavier said. "My wife, my daughter, and maybe a bit of luck. Right place, right time for the hospital job." "Don't discount your own agency," the professor countered. "Many people with support systems still struggle to reinvent themselves after displacement. There's something about your approach, a willingness to learn, to see value in different kinds of work, that made a difference." Xavier wasn't entirely comfortable with the praise, but he recognized the truth in it. He had changed, had allowed himself to change despite initial resistance. That willingness, as much as any external factor, had shaped his experience of the transition. As the wedding celebration continued around them, Xavier watched Judith dancing with Dave's father, Jackie laughing with college friends, guests from different parts of their lives mingling and connecting. Life moving forward as it always did, regardless of factory closures or economic shifts or personal disruptions. In December 2010, nearly a year after Xavier began his job at the hospital, a winter storm hit Muncie, dropping 10 inches of snow and causing power outages across the city. Ball Memorial Hospital switched to generator power, its critical systems continuing to function while much of the surrounding area went dark. Xavier was called in for an emergency shift, navigating the snow-covered streets in his truck to reach the hospital, where all hands were needed to manage the crisis. For 36 hours, he worked alongside his colleagues to keep the facility operational, checking generator function, clearing snow from critical access points, helping with emergency repairs as equipment strained under the unusual conditions. The work was exhausting but deeply satisfying. Every task completed meant continued care for patients who couldn't be moved, continued safety for staff working extended shifts, continued functionality for a facility that the community desperately needed during the emergency. Xavier's manufacturing background, his familiarity with mechanical systems, his calm approach to troubleshooting under pressure, his physical stamina despite his heart condition, proved invaluable. When the crisis finally eased, with power restored to most areas and the hospital returning to normal operations, Xavier found himself in the cafeteria with several colleagues, all of them exhausted but sharing a sense of accomplishment. "Couldn't have managed without you, Poulsen," Robert said, raising a cup of coffee in salute. "That generator issue in the East Wing would have taken us hours to figure out without your help." "Just doing my job," Xavier said automatically, the response ingrained from decades in a culture where drawing attention to individual contributions was discouraged. "No, man," Darnell interjected. "That was above and beyond. You should be proud." Pride, it was a feeling Xavier had associated primarily with his years at BorgWarner, pride in the quality of the components he helped produce, pride in being part of something substantial and enduring. He hadn't expected to feel it so strongly in this new context, this second career that had initially seemed like a compromise, a necessity rather than a choice. But there it was, a warm glow of satisfaction not just in having contributed during a crisis, but in having found a place where his skills and experience were valued, where his work mattered in tangible ways. It wasn't the same pride he had felt at the plant, but it was genuine and meaningful nonetheless. As 2010 drew to a close, Xavier took stock of the year behind him. It had been one of the most challenging periods of his life, completing the transition from BorgWarner, adapting to his role at the hospital, managing his health, adjusting to a new identity. There had been difficult days, moments of doubt and frustration, times when the past had seemed preferable to the uncertain present, but there had also been growth, discovery, new connections. He had learned that his capacity for adaptation was greater than he had imagined, that his value as a worker, as a person, was not tied exclusively to one job or one company. That change, while painful, could lead to unexpected opportunities. On New Year's Eve, Xavier and Judith hosted a small gathering at their home, friends from the hospital, a few former colleagues from BorgWarner who had remained in Muncie, neighbors who had become closer over the years. As midnight approached, they all moved to the backyard despite the cold, glasses of champagne in hand, waiting for the moment of transition from one year to the next. Xavier stood with his arm around Judith, watching their breath cloud in the winter air, the stars sharp and clear in the black sky above. Around them, their friends talked and laughed, their voices creating a comfortable murmur of community and connection. The physical landscape of his life had changed, the BorgWarner plant now partially demolished, the hospital his daily workplace, but the emotional landscape had proven more resilient. The values that had guided him throughout his working life, diligence, craftsmanship, loyalty, contribution, remained relevant, even as their expression took new forms. As the countdown to midnight began, Xavier thought about his father's pocket knife, still carried in his pocket each day, not as a weight tying him to the past, but as a reminder of continuity amid change. The past informing the present, which would in turn shape the future. 10, 9, 8, the group counted down together. Xavier turned to Judith, seeing in her face the accumulated years of their shared life, the struggles and joys, the constants and the variables. She had been his anchor during the turbulence of the past 2 years, believing in his capacity to adapt even when he had doubted it himself. 3, 2, 1, Happy New Year. As cheers erupted around them, Xavier kissed his wife, a gesture both familiar and newly appreciative. Then he raised his glass to the year ahead, to the continuing journey of adaptation and discovery, to the work still to be done. The BorgWarner plant in Muncie was gone, but Xavier Poulsen remained, changed by his experiences but not defined solely by them, carrying the past with him as he moved into a future that, while different from what he had once imagined, still held purpose and possibility. Happy New Year, he said to Judith, his voice firm with resolve and quiet hope. Here's to whatever comes next.